Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Stevie channel. And today we're going to be talking about school sport in South Africa, and particularly rugby as the sport that has just blown up. And it's created quite a big buzz across the country with regards to the commodification of school sport and the commodification potentially of young athletes and school boys and school girls, and what that is doing to the schools, the structures, the children, the coaches, and basically the school environment, where we have now suddenly got a ultra high performance and ultra professional school sport environment to a level we probably didn't think we would reach so quickly within the commodification of school sport and the rise of technology and streaming and super sports schools and the likes of that. But at the end of the day, I think the reality is that it's a situation that was inevitable, and it's going to be interesting to see the kind of discussions that are going to have to be had in the next few years with regards to what this future looks like. So for a bit of context, quite a few years ago, School Sports Live kind of took the country by storm by going and broadcasting school sports onto YouTube. And schools could bring them in, they would go and do specific school events, and you could all of a sudden, you could be sitting at home watching schoolboy rugby all over. The showing of schoolboy games is not a new concept. The F&B Classic Clashes was happening well over a decade, almost 2 decades ago, where specific school matches were broadcast. Craven Week was broadcast, and you could watch all these kind of games on TV. But that was sort of always held for the elite of the elite, your sort of special matches. You'd kind of have the Derby Day series, and you'd kind of have one match from a school being broadcast a year. And it was a massive thing. Fast forward, we now have schools like Hoërskool Brackenfell who have got an entire live stream container where they basically live stream every single one of their games to YouTube. They film all their matches and all their teams. So where a few years ago, you'd be lucky if you had one game kind of recorded or shown, there are now schools and lots of schools where basically every single one of the first team under 16As, all these different matches are live streamed, archived, and available to the general public. And what we are seeing is an incredible amount of money flowing through school sport, with basically almost R1 billion being spent by the top 200 rugby schools in the country every year on school sport. And the question is this a good thing and is this a bad thing? And I think I kind of sort of sit in the middle. At the end of the day, we can't look at it with rose-tinted glasses and basically say that any sort of commodification of juniors or children or people under 18 is a bad thing. And we've got to look at the good with the bad, because there are obviously going to be ramifications and there's obviously going to be negative consequences of this environment. But you've also got to look at then the positive consequences, as well as, for me, the inevitability of a system which has just scaled recently, but mirrors a lot of what happens around the world already. And that is elite environments from young ages. So now what we are seeing in South Africa with streaming, with recording, with more attention on school sport than ever before, we are seeing the further professionalization, to be honest, of school sport. Now, I was on the ground covering St. Andrews College, Kingswood College, Graham College when I was at varsity about 12 years ago. And already, coming from a small sort of co-ed school, there was a completely different level of approach to the rugby programs, even the hockey programs. And we're talking about, having multiple coaches. We're talking about a strength and conditioning aspect to this. We're talking about people who had specific roles. Back sort of when I was at school, you kind of pretty much had, at a push, maybe a forwards coach and a backlines coach. Certainly didn't necessarily have a specific strength and conditioning coach. And it definitely didn't have strength and conditioning coaches per age group, under 14, under 15, under 16, under 17. But we're going to be naive if we're going to sit there and say that these sort of structures and the professionalization wasn't started a long time before we've kind of hit what we think is the current sort of pinnacle and the peak of it. And I think what we need to be very mindful about the fact is that we are now in a situation, we're now in a world environment where sport has become, and lots of different sports, a huge career path. And people are accumulating generational wealth from playing sport. And as such, it has become as important for a sports program to be as important as an academic program when you're going to go on to become go into finance or go become a doctor or go into teaching and sort of find that job security. Sport is providing a platform for athletes to set their families up for life. If you look at the kind of money being earned by cricketers, not even at a national level, you've got players who are millionaires that have never played a game for South Africa due to the SA20 and the various different T20 franchise leagues all around the world. We have got teenagers in the IPL earning big money. We've got teenagers. I mean, Quentin Mpaka was basically earned over R1 million when he was still in school by going and being a net bowler for the IPL. So this professionalization of young athletes has been going on for a long time. If you look at, for example, the United States football system and the baseball system and sort of the competitiveness you see when it comes to sort of the collegiate system and how they are sort of scouting players straight out of high school and the pressure on those sort of players, we kind of saw it from a movie's point of view. It's kind of disjointed, but these are not new structures. If we look at the UK and Europe and the European football structures, for example, you've got academies from under 8s, under 9s, under 10s, under 11s, where kids basically go sort of full-time football players from teenage years, from 11, 12, 13 years old. By kind of 14, 15, we've already kind of known whether people are going to sort of potentially make it or have a chance to make it or not. What we are now seeing, though, is that on South African shores. And I think it was always going to be, again, what he mentioned, an inevitability. Now, what we've got to look at now is the current scenario we've got, and that is, as I mentioned, a R1 billion rugby program. Schools where they are pumping millions into their different sports programs. Situations where an old boys union is funding Jake White to be a consultant down at Selborne College. We've got coaches who have coached at the highest level becoming schoolboy coaches, and that schoolboy coaches is no longer kind of the stepping stone. Some of them, that's a pinnacle, inverted commas. It's a step up in their career from being maybe an assistant coach at a Pumas Greek, was even at a URC franchise level. We're looking at rugby programs that have got director of rugbies, they've got head coaches, they've got strength and conditioning coaches, they've got analysis happening. You've got people who are literally feeding coaches information in real time about what's happening and all the sort of different camera angles. And we have created a professional environment. Now, what is the good things of this? Well, it's quite simple. We are back-to-back rugby world champions, and South Africa produces more international and professional rugby players than any other nation in the world, for good reason, because our schoolboy structures have always been strong. And I think at the moment, we are now going to see a completely different breed of a program that's always been one of the best in the world taken to a different level. And it's only going to be a good thing for South African rugby at the end of the day. If we want to look at how it's going to impact our sport, the professionalization, commercialization of our sport will lead to stronger performances. We already see more funding going into hockey, athletics, soccer, water polo, some of the sports which have never been, or notoriously have been badly funded. If you look at hockey, for example, it has been a notoriously badly funded sport where your Proteas hockey teams have to self-fund themselves to go to World Cups. Now, we're now seeing a massive push towards developing hockey in the country with, the rivalries and the streaming and the professionalization of it. And what we're seeing, most importantly, is investment. So yes, it's investment to the school system, but that investment is definitely starting to feed over into your senior levels. And we are now producing a standard of athlete which is higher than ever before, which means that we're now hopefully going to be competing at a level we've never done before. And where we once maybe had a Proteas hockey team, which was always going to kind of often compete with Egypt for the best of the continent, but they would not necessarily be the best in, top 10 in the world. What we're going to see now is hopefully a much stronger representation of sort of players who are good enough to play overseas, who are good enough to make further stages in the World Cups, and the investment will follow. The rugby is your sort of ultimate example of just lots of money being thrown into programs. And yes, there are going to be scrutiny about it because we're going to be talking about the fact that these players are under so much pressure at such a young age. The mental toll it's taking on players will have to be addressed. We can't ignore that this is not going to happen. We can't ignore the scrutiny that they face. They're being analyzed. They're being beamed around screens. If you get hammered in a tackle, for example, you're being clipped up and put on social media. You're being shared. You become a bit of a public figure if you play for these top sort of sporting teams. And that is something we're going to have to navigate. And I don't have the solutions. There is no sort of easy way of being able to navigate and negotiate what the sort of inevitable consequences of this environment is. But at the same time, we've got to look at what this is doing for some of our young generation, and what it is doing. It's setting them up. You look at the story now of the two Mackenzie brothers who went over to exchange in Scotland and have now been offered a place and taking up places in the Glasgow Academy next year, and they've signed a professional rugby contract directly out of school. This is a good thing at the end of the day. We talk about a youth unemployment rate. We talk about the fact that there are so few jobs in this country and that there's a massive issue. The fact that more and more people are able to make sports a career, and not just the playing point of view. This is, I think, always what we kind of tend to forget, is the job creation that this sort of environment creates, that the economic benefit of needing more coaches, needing more skills, needing more strength and conditioning coaches, needing more analysts, needing more cameramen and the likes of that. There is lots of very, very good benefits, tangible benefits for an improved sporting system. What we need is checks and balances. What we need to do is ensure that we keep a hand and a sort of a finger to the pulse about the framework and how we sort of navigate this space. Professional environments at young ages are very old. As I said, we've had them in European with football. We've seen it in the collegiate system and your minor league, baseball and your little league baseball and the likes of that in the States. We've seen it even here. The professionalization of rugby systems is not a new concept. As I said, even when I was covering it many years ago, and even at school, you could already see the kind of levels to the game that there were. We're seeing an SA20 schools competition where all of a sudden school kids are, playing at stupidly high levels and making IPL teams while still being teenagers, the likes of this. Much like we saw, English footballers making international debuts or making Premier League debuts as teenagers. So all that we really are doing is catching up to the rest of the world. And in that regard, we can't be overly surprised at, that this was going to happen. The problem is that it's happened during a time where social media is at its absolute biggest and also most toxic. If we're going to be brutally honest, there is a lot of negative aspects of social media at the moment. The UK is looking at bringing the age of being allowed to be on social media to 16. Australia looking at blanket bans of certain social media platforms. Where this kind of becomes a bit murky is where's the money coming from in these programs. And you look at betting agencies and alcohol brands wanting to get involved, and kind of, where do we draw the moral high ground as to where the money can come from to fund these programs, which are mostly through old boys associations and former players and local. We've kind of moved away from just the local businesses kind of supporting the local rugby side. You've now got massive major brands backing school teams. So it's a continued give and take situation where I think we need to be very cognizant about the effects, and we need to ensure that we support the athlete. Fundamentally, school athletes will need more support now than ever before. And we need to ensure that as this environment increases, that the structures are in place to protect their welfare. And if we can do that, then hopefully we need to find the happy marriage of funding schools and sports programs, building better facilities, building better resources, becoming more resource schools where we can take play. I mean, you can't look at a situation where a player is taken from an underprivileged background, given a scholarship to a top school, and all of a sudden they go on to have a sporting career they would never have had without that opportunity. We can't look at that and think, we don't want that. But we've got to understand that to have that, there will be certain parts that maybe we don't want, or to the extent we don't want it. And unfortunately, there's no easy way of navigating this and making sure that it's going to be a perfect environment. It'll never be perfect. But what we've got to make sure we can do is absolutely maximize the best parts of it, whilst ensuring that we are putting in structures, whilst we are very aware and on the ground, and ensuring that we support the youth and the athletes to make sure that player welfare is always going to be the central point of all of this expansion. The commercialization of athletes like this thing. At the end of the day, we need to make sure our athletes come first. And we need to be proactive about the steps we take to protect them and to ensure that their needs are being taken care of. And the priority is always to see how do we better our athletes and not just use them to create an elite sporting environment at the cost of maybe some of their, their mental health and their stress and some of their careers, even, for example, where they might push themselves too hard or be silly and play through injuries because of this whole idea that I have to try and make it. So what do you think? Where do you sit in the whole school sport argument and debate? It's a very interesting one that's going to very much develop over the next few years, and hopefully I'm going to be speaking to some guys on the channel in the future about exactly where this is all going. But let me know what your comments are. Let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. Smash a like on the video. Subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Stevie P, and I'll see you guys all on the Stevie P channel very soon.